Breaking news, US President Trump has said that the war on Iran is pretty much over, quote unquote. In an interview with CBS News, Trump said, "I think the war is very complete, pretty much."
Iran spent decades building its air force. Not a modern one, not a technologically advanced one, but something that, at the very least, could defend its own skies. Something that could challenge an enemy long enough to make any invasion painful. But when the moment finally came, none of that mattered. In less than a day, Iran's air power was shattered. Aircraft that had taken years to maintain were destroyed in minutes. Air bases that once hosted fighter squadrons became smoking craters. And pilots who had trained for years never even got the chance to take off. This wasn't a traditional air battle. There were no dramatic dogfights over the desert. No waves of Iranian jets rising to meet American fighters. Instead, what unfolded looked more like a carefully choreographed dismantling of an entire military branch. One strike after another. One base after another. And by the time the dust settled, Iran's air force was barely recognizable. The air bases that never got a chance. The destruction didn't begin in the skies. It began on the ground. Satellite images and combat footage began appearing almost immediately after the first wave of strikes. One clip showed an Iranian fighter jet sitting quietly on the runway of a remote airbase. The aircraft had barely begun taxiing when a precision-guided munition struck nearby. The explosion was instant. Flames engulfed the aircraft before it had even reached the end of the runway. Scenes like this repeated across multiple Iranian bases. Aircraft parked in hardened shelters were hit by bunker-penetrating bombs. Runways were cratered. Fuel depots exploded in massive fireballs visible from miles away. Bases like Tabriz, Bandar Abbas, and Dezful quickly became focal points of the operation. At Tabriz Air Base, several aircraft were reportedly destroyed before their engines even started. Older fighters like the F-4 Phantom and F-5 Tiger were among the first casualties. Some of these planes had been in service for more than 40 years. For Iran, every one of them mattered. Unlike larger air forces, Iran doesn't have hundreds of modern replacement aircraft waiting in reserve. Losing even a handful of fighters can significantly weaken its ability to patrol its own airspace. But the strikes didn't stop with a handful. They kept coming. Wave after wave of missiles and airstrikes targeted the exact locations where Iranian aircraft were stored. Hangars collapsed. Radar towers were flattened. Command buildings were reduced to rubble. And in many cases, the pilots assigned to those aircraft never even had time to reach their cockpits. Why nothing took off? Perhaps the most shocking detail of the entire operation is this. Very few Iranian fighter jets ever made it into the air. Despite having hundreds of aircraft on paper, the Iranian Air Force launched almost no defensive sorties during the opening phase of the conflict. There are several reasons for this. The first is simple timing. The strikes began with overwhelming speed. American and Allied forces hit key air bases almost simultaneously, targeting runways, aircraft shelters, and fuel storage facilities. Without intact runways or available fuel lines, even a perfectly functioning aircraft can't take off. But that was only part of the strategy. The real disruption happened hours earlier. Before the first missile ever hit an Iranian airbase, something else was already underway behind the scenes. A massive electronic and cyber operation had quietly begun dismantling Iran's ability to detect and respond to incoming attacks. Communications networks were disrupted. radar systems began experiencing unexplained outages. Military command centers struggled to coordinate their response. By the time Iranian commanders realized what was happening, many of their systems were already offline. Air defense radars that should have been tracking incoming aircraft were suddenly blind. Missile batteries that were supposed to protect air bases struggled to lock onto targets. And in the confusion, the first wave of airstrikes arrived. The technology gap. Even if Iran had managed to launch its fighters, the outcome might not have been very different. Most of Iran's combat aircraft are relics from another era. Many were originally delivered in the 1970s, long before modern stealth technology, advanced radar systems, and network-centric warfare became the standard in air combat. Among the most capable aircraft in Iran's inventory are aging F-14 Tomcats, once considered one of the most advanced fighters in the world. But those jets were designed during the Cold War. Maintaining them today is incredibly difficult. Sanctions have prevented Iran from purchasing replacement parts for decades. As a result, technicians often rely on cannibalizing other aircraft to keep a small number operational. Even then, reliability is far from guaranteed. Engines fail. Electronics malfunction. Weapons systems struggle to function the way they were originally designed. Now compare that to the aircraft deployed against them. Modern American fighters like the F-35, F-15 Strike Eagle, and F-18 Super Hornet are equipped with radar systems that can detect targets from enormous distances. Many carry precision weapons capable of destroying aircraft on the ground from dozens of miles away. In other words, Iranian fighters didn't need to be shot down in the sky. They could be destroyed before they even left the runway. And that is exactly what happened. A carefully planned operation. What makes this entire campaign even more remarkable is how methodically it was executed. Military planners didn't simply launch a sudden attack and hope for the best. Instead, the operation appears to have been built around one clear objective: remove Iran's ability to control its own skies as quickly as possible. To do that, they targeted three key elements simultaneously. First, the aircraft themselves. Second, the infrastructure needed to operate them. And third, the systems responsible for protecting those assets. Once those three pillars were removed, the rest of the Air Force would effectively collapse on its own. And within hours, that is exactly what began to happen. Air bases that once hosted dozens of fighter jets were left with burning wreckage. Control towers stopped transmitting. Radar networks fell silent. And Iran's pilots, trained for years to defend their country's airspace, suddenly found themselves grounded with nowhere to go. But destroying aircraft and air bases was only part of the story, because the real reason this operation succeeded so quickly had less to do with bombs, and far more to do with the collapse of Iran's air defense network. And once those defenses began to fail, the skies over Iran became wide open. When the air defenses went dark, destroying aircraft on the ground is one thing. Doing it across an entire country without losing aircraft of your own is something else entirely. For that to happen, Iran's air defense network had to be neutralized first. And that appears to be exactly what happened. Before large numbers of American aircraft ever crossed into Iranian airspace, a different battle was already underway. One fought across radar frequencies, data links, and electronic signals. Iran relies on a layered air defense system made up of radar stations, missile batteries, and command centers spread across the country. In theory, this network should detect incoming aircraft long before they reach critical targets. But in modern warfare, detection doesn't always mean protection. Electronic warfare can blind radar systems, confuse missile guidance, and disrupt communications between command units. When that happens, even advanced missile systems can become useless. According to multiple defense analysts, that's precisely the environment Iranian air defenses found themselves in. Radar stations suddenly began losing contact with each other. Signals became scrambled. Some operators reported seeing phantom targets appearing and disappearing across their screens. In other cases, radar systems simply stopped responding. For the personnel responsible for defending Iranian airspace, it must have been chaos. Missile crews rely heavily on radar data to identify incoming threats. If those radar feeds are compromised, the entire defensive chain begins to collapse. And while Iranian operators struggled to understand what was happening, the next phase of the operation was already underway. Precision strikes across multiple bases. Once the air defense network began to falter, strike aircraft and long-range weapons moved in. This is where the operation became devastatingly effective. Rather than launching massive bombing raids against single targets, the strikes were spread across numerous air bases at nearly the same time. This approach prevented Iranian forces from concentrating their defenses in one location. By the time commanders realized one base was under attack, another base hundreds of miles away was already being hit. At Desful Air Base, several aircraft shelters were destroyed in quick succession. These reinforced bunkers are designed to protect aircraft from conventional bombing attacks, but modern bunker-penetrating weapons can punch through thick concrete before detonating. In some cases, aircraft inside the shelters were destroyed before crews could even open the hangar doors. Meanwhile, another series of strikes targeted the airbase at Bandar Abbas, a strategic location near the Strait of Hormuz. Bandar Abbas plays a key role in Iran's southern air defense network. It houses fighter aircraft, surveillance assets, and logistical support units responsible for monitoring maritime activity in the Persian Gulf. Once that base was hit, Iran lost one of its most important southern air hubs. Further north, additional strikes targeted radar installations and command centers responsible for coordinating fighter responses. Without these command centers, even operational aircraft would struggle to receive instructions about where to fly or what targets to engage. And that was exactly the goal. Remove the coordination, remove the radar, remove the aircraft, and the entire system collapses. Why Iran's fighters stayed on the ground? At this point, the obvious question becomes unavoidable. If Iran still had hundreds of aircraft on paper, why didn't its pilots launch a counterattack? Why didn't squadrons scramble into the sky to challenge the incoming forces? The answer lies in the condition of the aircraft themselves. Iran's Air Force has long struggled with maintenance issues due to decades of international sanctions. Many of its fighter jets date back to the 1960s and 1970s. While Iranian engineers have managed to keep some of them operational through creative repairs and locally manufactured components, maintaining an aging fleet is extremely difficult. Aircraft that appear ready for combat may actually require hours, or even days, of preparation before they can safely take off. And when air bases are being hit by precision strikes, there is no time for lengthy preparation. Fuel trucks are destroyed, maintenance crews scatter, runways become cratered. Even if a fighter jet is technically operational, it still needs ground support to fly. Without that support, the aircraft remains stuck on the tarmac. Some reports even suggest that Iranian pilots attempted to prepare their aircraft for emergency takeoff during the first hours of the strikes. But the attacks were simply too fast. Runways were damaged before aircraft could line up for departure. Hangars were destroyed before engines could be started. In several cases, aircraft were hit while still parked in their shelters. The result was a devastating loss of equipment before any aerial combat could even begin. The aircraft Iran relied on. To understand just how vulnerable Iran's air force was, it helps to look at the aircraft that make up its fleet. Many of Iran's fighters were purchased before the 1979 revolution, when the country still maintained close relations with the United States. That means some of its most capable aircraft are actually American designs. The famous F-14 Tomcat, once flown by the U.S. Navy, remains part of Iran's Air Force inventory. Iran was the only country outside the United States to ever operate this aircraft. In its prime, the F-14 was one of the most advanced fighters in the world. But today, those jets are more than 40 years old. Keeping them operational without access to original parts has been a constant challenge. Alongside the F-14S are older aircraft like the F-4 Phantom and the F-5 Tiger. Both aircraft were formidable in their time, but they were designed for an era of air combat that looks very different from modern warfare. Against advanced fighters equipped with modern radar, stealth technology, and beyond visual range missiles, these older jets face enormous disadvantages. And then there are the Russian aircraft Iran acquired later, including the MiG-29 and Su-24. These aircraft are somewhat newer, but even they are decades old compared to modern Western fighters. In other words, even if Iran had managed to launch a large number of aircraft into the sky, they would still be facing one of the most technologically advanced air forces on the planet. But the reality is far worse, because by the time those aircraft might have been ready to fly, many of them had already been destroyed. Radar blindness, when Iran couldn't see the war. By the second phase of the operation, something even more dangerous for Iran had already happened. Its radar network had begun collapsing. In modern warfare, radar is the eyes of an air defense system. Without it, missile batteries cannot detect aircraft, command centers cannot track threats, and fighter pilots cannot be guided toward incoming enemies. For Iran, that network was supposed to stretch across the entire country. Long-range radar installations on mountains and coastal regions monitored airspace hundreds of miles away. Short-range systems filled the gaps. Missile batteries stood ready to intercept any aircraft that entered Iranian territory. At least, that was the plan. But when the strikes began, many of those systems were either offline or malfunctioning. Electronic warfare aircraft operating far outside Iranian territory began flooding the electromagnetic spectrum with powerful jamming signals. These signals interfere with radar frequencies, creating confusion for operators trying to identify real targets. On radar screens, incoming aircraft can disappear. Or worse, dozens of fake targets can suddenly appear. Operators may see aircraft where none exist, while missing the real threats approaching at high speed. At the same time, cyber attacks reportedly targeted Iran's command networks. Communication links between radar stations and air defense command centers became unreliable. In some cases, radar data simply never reached the missile crews responsible for launching interceptors. Even the most advanced missile system becomes useless if it cannot see the target. And that blindness spread quickly across Iran's defense network. The first bombers arrive. With Iranian air defenses struggling to function, the next stage of the operation began. Heavy bombers entered the fight. These aircraft don't operate like fighter jets. They don't engage in dogfights or chase enemy planes through the sky. Instead, they deliver massive payloads of precision weapons against fixed targets. Once the air defenses were weakened, these bombers could operate with far greater freedom. And the targets they were assigned were extremely important. Instead of focusing only on aircraft, the strikes expanded to include radar stations, command facilities, ammunition depots, and maintenance centers. Destroying a fighter jet is effective. Destroying the facilities needed to repair and maintain the rest of the fleet is even more devastating. Air bases that survived the first wave of attacks now found themselves under even heavier bombardment. Massive explosions tore through storage bunkers. Maintenance hangars collapsed. Fuel storage tanks erupted into towering fireballs. Each strike removed another piece of the infrastructure needed to operate an air force. And with every passing hour, the situation became more hopeless for Iranian commanders. The runways that stopped the warplanes. One of the most effective strategies used during the campaign involved something surprisingly simple. Runways. A fighter jet cannot take off without a runway. Even minor damage to the surface can make it impossible for aircraft to accelerate safely. Military planners know this, so instead of targeting only the aircraft themselves, many strikes focused on destroying the runways those aircraft depended on. Specialized weapons designed for runway denial were used to crater the surfaces of major airbases. These bombs are engineered to punch deep holes into the concrete, leaving massive craters that are extremely difficult to repair quickly. Some runways were hit multiple times in different locations, ensuring that even emergency repairs wouldn't restore them fast enough. Within hours, several of Iran's major air bases were effectively grounded. Aircraft that survived the first wave of attacks were trapped. Even if pilots managed to start their engines, there was nowhere for them to go. This strategy is devastatingly efficient. You don't need to destroy every aircraft if none of them can take off. And that is exactly what began happening across Iran. Pilots with no way to fight. For Iran's fighter pilots, the situation must have been incredibly frustrating. Many of them had trained for years to defend their country's airspace. They understood the risks of facing a technologically superior opponent, but they never expected the fight to end before it even began. Air bases that once buzzed with activity were suddenly silent. Runways were cratered. Control towers were destroyed. Fuel depots burned through the night. And aircraft that might have been able to launch were damaged beyond repair. Even worse, the pilots had almost no reliable information about what was happening across the rest of the country. With communications disrupted and radar systems failing, command centers struggled to maintain a clear picture of the battlefield. Some pilots reportedly waited in readiness rooms for orders that never came. Others were ordered to evacuate their bases as incoming strikes were detected. In a war where speed and coordination determine survival, Iran's Air Force found itself paralyzed. The skies become completely open. By the third day of operations, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. With many radar systems destroyed and numerous air bases crippled, the skies over large parts of Iran became increasingly open. American and Allied aircraft began flying deeper into Iranian territory. Surveillance aircraft monitored remaining air defense systems. Strike aircraft continued targeting missile launchers, logistics hubs, and military infrastructure. What had started as a rapid strike campaign was now turning into something else entirely: persistent air dominance. In simple terms, that means one side can operate freely in the air while the other cannot. And once that situation develops, the balance of the entire conflict changes. Without an air force capable of defending its territory, Iran's military options became far more limited. Ground forces lose protection from above. Supply lines become vulnerable. Military bases become easy targets. Air power shapes the battlefield in ways that few other tools can match. And now, Iran had almost none of it left. But there was still another factor behind the collapse of Iran's air force. Even before the first missile struck an airbase, the fleet itself was already struggling to survive. Decades of sanctions, aging aircraft, and constant maintenance problems had quietly weakened Iran's air power long before this war ever began. And when the bombs finally started falling, those weaknesses became impossible to hide. The Air Force that was already struggling. Long before the first bomb hit an Iranian airbase, the country's Air Force was already facing serious problems. On paper, Iran appeared to have a sizable fleet. Estimates suggested that the Iranian Air Force possessed somewhere around 350 to 400 aircraft. That number included fighter jets, attack aircraft, reconnaissance planes, and support platforms. But numbers on paper can be misleading, because in reality, a large portion of those aircraft were barely operational. Many had been grounded for years. Others were kept in storage simply to be stripped for spare parts. And some had become little more than museum pieces that technicians struggled to keep alive. The core issue was sanctions. For decades, Iran has faced strict restrictions that prevent it from purchasing replacement parts for many of the aircraft in its fleet. That might not sound like a huge problem at first, but aircraft require constant maintenance. Engines wear down, hydraulic systems leak, avionics fail, and even small components can prevent an aircraft from flying safely. Without a reliable supply of parts, maintenance crews are forced to improvise. In Iran's case, that often meant cannibalizing one aircraft to repair another. Technicians would remove working components from grounded planes and install them into aircraft that were still being used for training or patrol missions. Over time, this process slowly reduced the total number of operational aircraft. Eventually, entire squadrons became dependent on a handful of functioning jets. The fleet that couldn't be maintained. The situation became even more difficult because many of Iran's aircraft are extremely old. Take the F-4 Phantom, for example. This fighter first entered service in the early 1960s. While it proved to be a powerful aircraft during the Cold War, keeping one operational today requires enormous effort. Replacement parts are difficult to obtain. Modern electronics are incompatible with many of its original systems, and the airframes themselves have endured decades of stress. Iran's fleet of F-5 fighters faces similar problems. These aircraft were designed as lightweight fighters that could be produced quickly and maintained cheaply. But even they require specialized components that Iran cannot easily obtain. Then there are the famous F-14 Tomcats. Iran's Tomcats are legendary because they are the only ones still flying anywhere in the world. When the United States retired its own F-14 fleet in 2006, Iran became the sole remaining operator. Keeping those aircraft operational without access to American spare parts has been a massive challenge. Over the years, Iranian engineers reportedly resorted to reverse engineering certain components or manufacturing limited replacements domestically. But that process is slow and expensive, and it doesn't always produce reliable results. The warning signs were already there. There were plenty of warning signs that Iran's Air Force was struggling long before the conflict began. Over the past decade, several accidents involving Iranian military aircraft raised serious concerns about the condition of the fleet. In some cases, aircraft crashed during routine training missions. In others, mechanical failures forced emergency landings. One particularly troubling incident involved a training accident that killed 2 Iranian pilots when their aircraft experienced a malfunction before even leaving the ground. Investigations later suggested that aging components may have contributed to the failure. When aircraft are maintained with improvised parts and aging systems, reliability becomes unpredictable. For a modern Air Force, that level of uncertainty can be extremely dangerous. Pilots need to trust their aircraft. They need to know that engines will perform when pushed to maximum power, and that critical systems will function correctly during combat. But if an aircraft might fail at any moment, that confidence disappears. And when pilots begin to lose trust in their machines, the entire Air Force becomes weaker. Only a fraction could actually fly. This brings us to a critical detail that many observers overlook. Not all of Iran's aircraft were flyable even before the conflict began. Military analysts had long estimated that only around half of the fleet was fully operational. In other words, out of roughly 400 aircraft, perhaps 200 were actually capable of flying combat missions. The rest were grounded due to maintenance issues, lack of spare parts, or structural fatigue. That meant Iran's true air power was already much smaller than it appeared. And when the strikes began destroying aircraft on the ground, the number of operational fighters dropped even further. Each destroyed aircraft represented not just the loss of equipment, but also the loss of years of maintenance effort and scarce resources. Replacing those losses would be extremely difficult, especially under the current sanctions. The pilots who never flew. Perhaps the most tragic consequence of this situation involves the pilots themselves. Training a fighter pilot takes years. Pilots must master complex aircraft systems, learn advanced tactics, and build thousands of hours of flight experience. Iran invested heavily in training its pilots over the decades. Many of them became highly skilled aviators capable of flying difficult missions under challenging conditions. But even the most talented pilot is powerless without an aircraft. When the strikes destroyed large portions of Iran's fleet, many of those pilots suddenly found themselves grounded. Their squadrons had no aircraft left to fly, and without planes, the years they spent preparing for combat became almost meaningless. It's a harsh reality of air warfare. A modern Air Force is not just about pilots or aircraft alone. It is about the entire system working together. Aircraft, runways, radar, maintenance crews, fuel supplies, command centers. When even one of those elements collapses, the entire force begins to unravel. And in Iran's case, multiple pieces of that system collapsed at the same time. But even with its air force shattered and its air defenses crippled, Iran still had one remaining option left on the battlefield. It wasn't fighter jets. It wasn't bombers. It was something far cheaper and far more numerous: drones. And in the next phase of the conflict, those drones would become Iran's last attempt to strike back. Iran's last option, the drone strategy. With its air force shattered and its air defenses crippled, Iran was left with very few ways to respond. Fighter jets were no longer an option. Air bases were damaged. Runways were cratered. Many of the aircraft that survived the first waves of strikes were either too old, too damaged, or simply trapped on the ground. But Iran still had one tool left: drones. For years, Iran has invested heavily in unmanned aerial vehicles. Compared to fighter jets, drones are relatively cheap to produce. They don't require highly trained pilots, and they can be launched from simple platforms scattered across large areas. In other words, drones are perfect for asymmetric warfare. Instead of relying on a few expensive aircraft, Iran could launch large numbers of smaller unmanned systems in an attempt to overwhelm enemy defenses. And that's exactly what began happening. Reports started emerging of Iranian drones being launched toward military installations and strategic locations across the region. Some targeted American facilities in the Gulf. Others were directed toward Allied bases and infrastructure. Unlike fighter jets, these drones don't need to land. Many are designed as one-way attack systems, meaning they are essentially flying explosives programmed to strike a specific target. From Iran's perspective, the strategy makes sense. A single interceptor missile fired by an advanced air defense system can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes even more. The drones they are trying to destroy might cost only a fraction of that. So even if many drones are shot down, the economic balance can still favor the attacker. This is one of the reasons drones have become so popular in modern conflicts. They are cheap, flexible, and relatively easy to deploy. But there is still a major limitation. Drones cannot replace an air force. They cannot patrol large areas of airspace the way fighter jets can. They cannot intercept enemy aircraft, and they cannot defend air bases from attack. At best, they can create disruption. And that's exactly what Iran hoped to achieve. The missile factor. Alongside its drone attacks, Iran also retains another capability: ballistic missiles. Iran possesses one of the largest missile arsenals in the region, with a variety of systems capable of striking targets hundreds or even thousands of miles away. These missiles are designed to compensate for weaknesses in Iran's conventional military forces. If Iran cannot dominate the skies with aircraft, it can still threaten enemy targets with long-range missile strikes. However, even this capability has faced serious pressure during the conflict. Many missile launch sites were targeted during the opening waves of strikes. Transporter erector launchers, mobile vehicles used to fire ballistic missiles, became priority targets. Destroying these vehicles severely limits Iran's ability to launch missiles effectively. Without those launch platforms, missiles cannot be deployed quickly. And without rapid deployment, they become much easier to detect and destroy. American and Allied surveillance aircraft have reportedly spent much of the conflict searching for these launch systems. Every launcher that is destroyed removes another potential threat. And every destroyed launcher weakens Iran's ability to retaliate, maintaining control of the skies. Meanwhile, American and Allied aircraft continue operating across the region with increasing freedom. Surveillance drones monitor potential threats. Fighter jets patrol strategic air corridors. Bombers strike remaining military infrastructure. This is the advantage of air superiority. Once one side gains control of the skies, maintaining that control becomes easier over time. Aircraft can move freely. Targets can be identified and struck quickly. And the opposing military finds itself constantly reacting instead of planning. Iran's remaining air defense systems still pose some risk. Hidden missile batteries could attempt surprise launches if they detect incoming aircraft. But without the radar coverage and coordination that once supported them, those systems are far less effective than they used to be. In many areas, the skies above Iran are now dominated by aircraft that Iran cannot challenge. And that reality shapes everything happening on the ground. A war decided before it began. Looking back at how this conflict unfolded, one thing becomes clear. The collapse of Iran's air force didn't happen overnight. It had been building for decades. Aging aircraft, sanctions that restricted access to spare parts, maintenance challenges that slowly reduced operational readiness. All of these problems weakened Iran's air power long before the first missile was launched. When the strikes finally came, those weaknesses were exposed instantly. Aircraft that could barely stay operational were destroyed before they could take off. Air bases that lacked modern defenses were hit with precision strikes. Radar systems that relied on outdated technology were blinded by electronic warfare. And within hours, the balance of power in the skies had shifted completely. The sky Iran lost in 24 hours. Today, the wreckage of aircraft scattered across Iranian air bases tells the story. Jets that once represented the backbone of the country's air defense now sit, burned out on shattered runways. Hangars that once protected fighter squadrons have collapsed. Control towers stand silent. And the pilots who once trained to defend their nation's skies now watch the conflict unfold from the ground. In modern warfare, air power often decides the outcome of battles long before ground forces ever move. And in this case, the battle for the skies may have been decided in less than a single day. Iran's air force didn't lose a dramatic dogfight. It never even got the chance to fight. Because by the time the war truly began, its aircraft were already gone.